Well, we're in a sermon series entitled Set Free. Set Free. And we're talking about all the ways that being in a relationship with God has the ability to set you free. That there are things in our lives that keep us trapped, that keep us hindered and closed off and enslaved, and how being in relationship with God has the potential to set you free from so much. And last week we talked about how being in a relationship with God can set you free from your own inadequacies. And we looked at Moses in the burning bush and how God came to Moses with a mission. And he said, I want you to go and confront Pharaoh, and I want you to go and rescue my people. And of course, Moses has all these issues. Don't you know I have a past? Don't you know I don't talk very well? Don't you know that, what if they don't believe me? And he's got all these problems, all these feelings of inadequacy that says, I can't do what you want me to do, God. And then God says, you know what? I know that already. I don't go to perfect people and get them to do my mission. I go to imperfect people, and I ask them to come and help me. So I know what your problems are, and I promise I'll be with you. I'll be with you. And how God, knowing that we're not perfect already, and yet He still picks us and still says, I'll be with you, helps to free us from our feelings of inadequacy. And this week we're talking about being set free from fear. I need like lightning bolts or crackling laughter or something when I say that. I feel like set free from fear. Fear. I don't like to be scared, usually. I don't like to watch scary movies. Not because I'm scared easily or anything, or not because I, can't sleep that night or anything. I just don't like that feeling. I don't take pleasure in, jumping or any of that, I know some people do, though. I know there are some of you out there who are really strange and really weird, and you love to watch scary movies, okay? And you, Lori's like, oh, what? That's not a big deal. And that's what you like to do. You like the popcorn jumping out of your lap and all that kind of stuff. And you like doing this a lot when you're watching movies and just kind of looking through the slits of your fingers. And some of you like that. And that's fine. That's fine. That's not me, though. But there's one kind of fear that, of course, no one likes, and that's real fear. Right? Real fear is when the doctor calls and says something was wrong with the tests. Real fear is when your spouse says, I just don't think this is working. Real fear is something that no one wants or enjoys or wants to partake in. Real fear paralyzes us. It cripples us. I'm afraid, so you don't do something. I'm afraid. I'm so afraid. And maybe it's just an overarching gloom in your life of a situation where things that you used to enjoy doing and things that used to bring you pleasure just don't anymore. And it paralyzes you. If you were robbed, you're afraid to go outside. If you're in a car accident, you're afraid to drive. If you spoke about Jesus once to someone and you were mocked or ridiculed, or they said something that you couldn't answer, or they made you feel like a fool, then I don't want to talk about that again. Fear is something that paralyzes it. It enslaves us. It traps us. I'm afraid. I don't want to do that because I'm so afraid. And there's two reasons why fear gets to us. Well, first of all, if you don't have God, then there are very real situations in your life where it's scary and it's afraid. Someone, like I said, the doctor tells you something, or you lose a job, or a child of yours dies in a car accident. I mean, those are very scary situations. And you think, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to my home? What's going to happen to my life in the future? What's going to happen to what's going to happen? And you're afraid. But we have a God who's promised to always be with us. The creator of the universe said, I will be with you. But we still get scared, and we still can be slaves to fear, even though we have that promise. Why is that? Well, there's two big reasons why, even though the God of the universe said, I'll be with you, we still feel fear. The first one is because we don't believe Him. I know that's what God said. I know that's what Cody said on Sunday. I know that I've heard this before, but I don't think I really believe it. Maybe I say I do, but then when something comes up, something scary happens in my life, something that causes me to be afraid, I don't really buy into that. Not really, that God's with me. And the second reason is that we don't really think God can handle it. God can handle certain problems. This person doesn't pray enough. That's a God problem. This person maybe lies once or twice. Maybe this person gossiped. But my problem's a little bit bigger than that. I don't think God can handle this. My problem's a little too real for that. I don't think God can handle that. So even though God, the creator of the universe, has said, I'll be with you, we still can be enslaved to fear because either we don't really buy into that or we don't really think he can actually help us. Sure, God's with us, but he's not big enough to help us. And there's a wonderful story in our Bibles. This is one of the defining moments in all of Jewish history. One of the defining moments in the history of the people of God in the Exodus account. And there's this incredible narrative in the Exodus account that really shows us that at times when we don't think God's with us, or at times when we don't think God can help, he can. And so there's not going to be one specific chief verse we're looking at. It's really Exodus chapters 6 through 12. So if you want to just read 6 through 12, then that's fine. But it's 6 chapters there. And we're looking at the actual Exodus account. And how in a time that when there was a lot of fear going on, that God actually showed, no, I'm with you, even though you may not realize it, and I am big enough to help. The very end of Joseph's life, Joseph, everyone kind of knows the story of Joseph, coat of many colors, brothers don't like him, beat him up and sell him into slavery, and then he's down in Egypt, he gets promoted to second in command, and then finally everything's going great, so he invites his family down. His family then moves to Egypt, so the Israelites are living in Egypt now. There's only about 70 of them, but they're living there, and then at the very end of Joseph's life, so now they're in Egypt, the very end of Joseph's life, this is what's recorded, Genesis chapter 50. Verse 24, soon I will die, but God will surely come to help you and lead you out of this land of Egypt. He will bring you back to the land he solemnly promised to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So God, through Joseph, reminds the people, I promised to bring you to a land. I promised this to Abraham, who was a long time earlier. I promised this to Abraham. And I promised it to Isaac and Jacob, and now I'm promising it to you. I'm promising it to you. I'm going to come and take you and bring you to a land that I promised to give you as an inheritance. That's the last word from God for 400 years. For 400 years, this promise just kind of hangs in the air. God promised to deliver us. God promised to take us out of Egypt. Now, at first, no one's in a hurry. Everything's great. Pharaoh loves us. The land that the people were given, the land of Goshen, it's on the eastern edge of the Nile. It's 900 square miles, and it's extremely fertile. I mean, it's just this wonderful, wonderful piece of land. Okay, so no one's really in a hurry to leave Egypt. But then in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, and this is just a few years after Joseph, this is what happens. It says this, eventually a new king came to power in Egypt, who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us, and then they will escape from the country. So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor, and they forced them to build cities for the king. So at first it's okay, No one's really complaining that God hasn't answered his promise yet. We're in this great land. We're protected. Everything's good. We're growing. But then a new king comes, doesn't really care about Joseph, sees all these foreigners and says, we need to do something about this, and makes them slaves. And for 400 years, God says nothing. And Israelites are sitting there waiting. Well, God, didn't you tell us? Is this supposed to be happening to us? Why are we being whipped and tortured and punished, and why are we being forced to work, sun up to sundown, and why is this happening to us? I thought you were supposed to come and take us. It's amazing. You really should read the Old Testament. It's amazing how often the story of Israel parallels our own lives. Because there are times in our lives where you feel close to God, isn't there? There's times in our lives where everything is going great, and you and God are just right together, and just everything is meshing, and you can feel God's power in your marriage and in your career and in your family and in your life and your church. You can just feel God. You feel him. You know he's there. You know what you do is right. You're on fire. You know that you and God are close. But then there's times in your life where you cry out to God and he doesn't answer you. And you go to be with God and you can't find him. And usually those times are associated with some kind of tragedy. Something happens to you and God is silent and he's absent. And it's in those times when we hear God's silence and we feel God's absence that we are tempted to think, maybe when he said he'd always be with us, he didn't really mean that. And that's when we let fear take over. Because those times in our lives, just like the Israelites are going through, 400 years where God says nothing. Well, maybe God didn't mean that when he said he would always be with me. Maybe that's not exactly what God meant. Maybe, just maybe, God's not real. Or at least doesn't care that much about me. And it's in those moments of silence, it's in those moments when you feel so far away from God, when you can begin to be afraid and the doctor says, you've only got this much time left to live. And then, oh, what about this? And what's going to happen? And why is this? Why me? And fear takes over your life and it paralyzes you. Because you went to God. When you heard that news, you went to God and he was silent. And you tried to feel for God and he was absent. So when we hear God's silence and we feel his absence, one of the options that's there for us is to just assume that he must have been either lying or I misheard, or maybe whoever I heard that from just made it up, that God would always be with us. But there's another option. When you hear God's silence and you feel God's absence, you can trust in God's presence. And here's what I mean by that. For 400 years, the last thing that God says to the Israelites, I'm going to take you out of here. I promised Abraham I'd give you this land. I promised it to Isaac and Jacob. Now I'm going to come and get you. I'm going to take you out of here. Last thing that the Israelites heard. For 400 years, God goes radio silent. But you know what's really interesting is that according to history, some very, let's use the word convenient things happened for the Israelites. Okay, a little bit before then, in Egypt, everything's going fine in Egypt, but there's a group of people, and this is not in the Bible, this is just from history, okay? This is just history lesson, right? So some of you are going to fall asleep, that's fine. Just from history, there's a group of people that moved from Asia, from actually kind of around where the Israelites would have been. So they look similar and have a similar culture to Joseph's people. But they're not Israelites. But anyway, they migrate from Asia to Egypt. And they just keep coming in and coming in and coming in. At first it's fine, but then they just keep coming and coming and coming. There's so many of them that finally Pharaoh says, we got to do something about this. And actually there's a battle that happens. And this group of people, they're known as the Hyksos, this group of people, they actually beat Pharaoh. And they take over the Egyptian government. Now, they don't make slaves of the Egyptians or anything. Everything pretty much stays the same, except there's a whole dynasty, several people in a row, of pharaohs who are not Egyptian. They're actually foreigners. They're actually Hyksos. Now, when Joseph comes down to Egypt, brothers sell him into slavery, that whole thing, they're in charge during that time period. So when they come down to Egypt and he suddenly gets promoted, did that ever seem strange to anyone? Hey, I can tell you what your dream is. Now make me second in command of your entire kingdom. No, maybe I'll just have you kind of be part of my wise men group, but I don't know if I'm going to promote you that high. It makes a little more sense when you realize that Pharaoh wasn't an Egyptian, that Pharaoh actually probably looked, sounded, and acted like Joseph did. Because he wasn't an Egyptian, he was a Hyksos. And so, conveniently, there's a non-Egyptian on the throne when Joseph arrives. Now, Joseph invites his family down. There's this 400 years period of silence. In that time, we know from later on, the book of Ezekiel, chapter 20, this is much later on, God is talking to Ezekiel. And this is really interesting. So if you fell asleep, just nudge the person next to you. This is the good part. God's talking to Ezekiel, and he's recounting the story of Israel. And he says, do you remember when I saved your people out of Egypt? Do you remember that? I said to them, put away the gods that you fell in love with when you were in Egypt. Ezekiel chapter 20, apparently what had happened was we're in this great land, we're protected, the ground is fertile, we're having, our people are growing, we have jobs, Pharaoh loves us. So why not just kind of start to worship some of the Egyptian gods too? It's all around us, everything's going good. I mean, come on, let's be honest with ourselves. God gets crowded out in our lives usually when things are going good, not so much when things are going bad. Usually when everything's perfect, my job is going, I got a promotion, my family, is great, we're taking trips all the time, everyone's loving each other, and just everything's wonderful. God's just kind of this footnote then to my life. And he's not really all that important. And that's kind of what happened. Yahweh, God, their God, became just one of several gods. We're here in Egypt, everything's great, let's just kind of start incorporating this. And then, conveniently, according to history, again, this is in our Bibles. It's at a chapter from Exodus chapter 1, Verse 8 I just read. The Egyptians revolt against the Hyksos, and they win. And a new Pharaoh comes to power, who's actually an Egyptian. And these foreigners have been ruling for long enough, so he actually takes a pretty aggressive stance against foreign people living in Egypt. And that's where we get recorded that a new king came to power who didn't care about Joseph and enslaved the Israelites. Now imagine if before that happened, let's say you're Moses. Pretend you're Moses, all right? So like staff and all that kind of stuff. You're Moses, and you go down to Egypt, and you tell the people, hey, God's ready. The time is right. We're going to go to the promised land. And it's before they were slaves. You've got a good job. You've got this killer farm. Pharaoh loves you. Your family is growing and prosperous. Everything is just wonderful. In fact, you've got some duties in a couple of the temples. Just everything is good. And then Moses comes and says, hey, let's leave, and we're going to trek across the desert, and we're going to go to the promised land. And, come with me. Right? There's like two of you who just, were really bad at gambling and are in debt that want to come with Moses. And the rest of you are like, no, we're staying here. Okay? We're going to stay here. But then the Egyptians revolt, and a new king comes to power, and this king enslaves the Israelites. And it's kind of like in our lives when everything's going great. Sometimes God gets crowded out. But then when something tragic happens, we realize, I really need God. And after they've been enslaved for a while, then Moses comes, and you say, hey, God wants to take you out of here. And of course, everyone's going to come. You see, there's 400 years where God is silent, but there's 400 years God's still working. All throughout history, and all these convenient events that happened to make it to where the people of Israel are ready, to make it to where the people of Israel are ready to go. God may have been silent, but he was still working. And when the time was right, he revealed himself. This didn't just happen then. There's another time in our Bibles, actually it's not in our Bibles, but between the Old Testament and New Testament, most of you, unless you have a Catholic Bible, most of you have just a blank white page. It says New Testament, right? This is 400 years. The last chapter of Malachi and the first chapter of Matthew, between those two, is 400 years where there's no prophet, there's no leader, there's no nothing, okay? This is 400 years of silence. In that time, three very convenient things happen before Jesus comes. First one is this. You may have heard of the guy, Alexander the Great. He comes to power. He takes over in Greece. He conquers the known world, okay, in his lifetime. He dies when he's 33. So, this is incredibly impressive that he basically just wins almost every battle he has. So he conquers the known world. He conquers most of Europe. He conquers the Middle East. He conquers down to India a little bit. He conquers Egypt. He conquers all this territory. And he didn't have a very good infrastructure because when he died, all of his generals kind of split up his kingdom and started fighting each other. But the one thing that he did do is he said, I want everyone to learn Greek. And for the first time in the history of the world, I guess since the Tower of Babel, for the first time in recorded history, everybody could speak the same language. It wasn't your primary language. If I lived in Jerusalem, my primary language would be Aramaic. If you lived in Rome, your primary language would be Latin. But we could talk to each other in Greek. For the first time in the history of the world, everyone could understand one another. Second thing that happened, Rome comes to power. Rome conquers the world too, okay? When Rome does that, they have a little bit better infrastructure and it lasts longer, okay? And there's one incredible thing that happens. For the first time in the history of the world, there's peace. And what I mean by that is this. If I lived in Jerusalem, all right? Let's say you lived in Jerusalem. You want to travel north to Thessalonica, okay? You got to go through a few other countries and a few other towns to get there. Now, you show up, and you look a lot different than them. You sound different than them. And you're from a different country than they are. Why don't we just kill him and we'll split the stuff up amongst the town elders? Who's going to know about it? Who's going to know about that? No one. This guy's going to set out on a journey. He's never going to come back, and that's going to be the end of it. But when Rome rules everything, you can't do that. In fact, the Romans had a name for it. It was called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And for the first time in the history of the world, you could travel from Jerusalem to Rome, and you wouldn't have to fear for your life. And the second thing that happened that the Romans did is they built roads. Roads everywhere. And for the first time in the history of the world, you could travel from Jerusalem to Rome in relative safety and pretty quickly. Everyone speaks the same language. You can travel freely. You can travel quickly. And then Jesus comes. Do you wonder how the church just exploded and grew so fast? Paul says it like this in Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. He says this, but when the right time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law, so that he could adopt us as his very own children. God waited for the right time to act. When we hear God's silence and we feel God's absence, remember that our God is still working. That your God is still working. That even though I can't hear him and I can't feel him, I'm going to trust that he's there. Because that's a problem on the receiver end. That's a problem on my end, that I can't hear him or feel him. But God is still working. For 400 years, God didn't talk, but he was still working. In our lives, there are times where we don't hear God, we don't feel God like we want to. Something terrible happens to us, and we say, God, where are you? I don't hear you, I don't feel you. But I'm going to trust that you're there. And I just can't see it clearly. And here's what that looks like. If you're gonna trust in God's presence, when you hear God's silence and you feel his absence, if you're going to trust in his presence, what that means is that we act as if we can feel God. We know what that looks like. If me and God are close and everything's going great, we know what that looks like. Loving others, serving, sharing, having an outward focus. But times when I can't hear God and I can't feel God, if I'm going to trust in God, I got to do the same thing. You see, fear paralyzes us. Trust energizes us. Fear causes us to look inward. Trust causes us to look outward. Because this terrible thing's happened. You only have 6 months left to live. But I trust that God is still there. I can't hear him. I can't feel him. I trust that he's there. And that means I'm still looking outward at you. So, God promises, I will always be with you. And there are times in our lives where we don't hear him or feel him, and we think maybe that promise was wrong. Trust that God meant what he said, and that even though we can't hear him or feel him, he's actually there. Now, the Israelites, they were enslaved in Egypt. Egypt was in the world superpower at the time. Okay, this is long time before the Romans, 1,500 years before the Romans. Okay, but they were the world superpower at the time. The Egyptians were, and everything about them was either old or powerful. Okay, I mean, by the time Moses came along, some of the pyramids were already 1,000 years old. Okay, by the time Moses came along, so 100 years ago, when Moses comes along. And there were already pyramids over 1,000 years old. I mean, that's how old the land of Egypt was. That's how ancient it was. Everything about the Egyptian culture and Egypt itself pointed to their power. They had huge temples and huge palaces. I mean, you've seen, for one, the pyramids, everyone knows what those look like. But, you've seen the sphinxes and all these huge statues. And, you're walking around and you're looking around. I mean, everything there talks about Egyptian power. Okay? And they've got this very, very impressive military. And even their king, even Pharaoh, wasn't just a normal king. He was believed to be a god incarnate. So they got all these huge statues, this big army, and hey, our king's even a god. So beat that, I mean, that's everything about their country was impressive. Do you think there might have been the slightest bit of fear on Moses' part that maybe God couldn't handle this? I mean, it's not like God's rescuing my people from the, Hittites or the Amorites. I mean, that would be, wouldn't even need God to do that. No, this is the Egyptians. Maybe he can't handle this. I mean, this is one God. They've got dozens of gods. That doesn't seem very fair. One on 50, that doesn't seem like a fair fight. Maybe God can't handle this. I mean, come on, we do the same thing in our lives. And maybe you've got this really weird idea, and unfortunately, I know a lot of people who have this, that this idea that God fits perfectly in people's lives who have 99% of their life figured out. That God is for that perfect family, for that perfect couple, for that perfect person, that God fits right into their lives. Because what do they have problems with? Well, again, they gossip once in a while, or they tell a lie, or, they didn't come to church one Sunday, God forbid. And, they have all these problems, that God works with those problems. God fits perfectly in that last 1%. They have 99% of their life figured out. God fits perfectly in that last 1%. I've got 3% of my life figured out, and taking my life from 3% to 4% doesn't sound all that impressive. My problems are big. My problems are dark. My problems are ugly. God doesn't work with that. God works with people who are almost there, and they just need that breeze to come along and push them over the finish line. I haven't even started the race yet. God doesn't work with me. My problems are way, way too big for that. God goes up against the Egyptians, and it's for this exact reason that God unleashes the plagues. We all know the plague story. Maybe we can't name them all, but we know of the plagues, okay? And I want you to realize this isn't because God had to do this, right? I mean, he's God. He can do whatever he wants. He could have went, all right, Israelites are in the promised land. It's over, okay? Right? And just zap them there. We're all good. He could have done that. He's God. He can do whatever he wants. But imagine for a second that he does do that. Moses, I want you to go tell Pharaoh, I'm going to rescue my people, and then I'm going to snap my fingers, and everyone will be in the promised land, and it'll be over. Do you think a few years down the road someone goes, well, maybe God got lucky. Maybe he kind of came in and just kind of snuck us out, and the Egyptian gods weren't really looking, and we got lucky with that. God uses the plagues to show the Israelites, the Egyptians, the whole world, I'm big enough. I can handle it. In fact, every one of the plagues actually attacks an Egyptian god. The Egyptians had a god of the Nile. So Moses says, my God's going to turn the Nile to blood. The Egyptians had a god of the harvest. Moses says, my God's going to send locusts and they're going to eat everything. The Egyptians, their chief god, kind of their Zeus, like the kind of top dog god, was the god of the sun, Amun-Ra. God says, I'm going to make everything dark. The Egyptians had a god of death and resurrection. And God says, if you do this, you'll be fine. If you don't do this, I'm going to take your firstborn son. Because I am God, and they are not. Because I am big enough to handle it. Because there is no one greater than me. And so whatever you're going through in your life, I don't know if it's bad news from the doctor. I don't know if it's a bad marriage. I don't know if you've lost someone close. Whatever you're going through in your life, I want you to know God is big enough to handle it. That there is nothing. God is not a God who fits in the 1% of anyone's life. If someone who's got 99% of their life figured out and they come to God, God's going to say, actually, you got about 1% of your life figured out. Now let me show you what you're missing. And if you come to God and you've only got 1% of your life figured out, God says, great, that's a great starting point. Because I'm a God who works miracles. God is big enough. Now, I'm not saying God's going to instantly fix your life. I mean, that's what the whole last part of the sermon was about. Sometimes God is silent. Sometimes God, he works on his own time. But I want you to know God's big enough. The bottom line for us this morning is this. We don't fear because God is near. We don't fear. We don't have to be afraid because God is near. Now, again, that's the basic promise. That's why I said at the very beginning. Everyone knows that. I heard that last week, Cody. I've heard that several times, and that's great. You're going to hear it several times again. We don't have to be afraid because God is with us. But we get afraid because we don't believe that. Because God is quiet, he's silent, he feels absent. We don't believe that. Or we think, well, God can't handle this problem. He handles other ones, but not this one. And we just saw that God works even when he's silent. Even in the silence in our Bibles, where we don't have anything recorded, we look at history and we see God was actually working. Our God works in the silence, and our God's big enough to handle problems. And so truly and sincerely, when I say we don't have to fear because God is near, I mean that. And we need to use this Exodus story to energize our lives. That's what the Israelites did. The Israelites looked back on this Exodus event, and they said, that's who we are. We're people who have been rescued by God. That's us. In fact, they took it too far. In 66 AD, the nation of Israel rebelled against Rome. There was a revolt. They said, we're not paying taxes to a pagan anymore, and they rebelled against Rome. Rome came in and killed a bunch of them and burned Jerusalem to the ground because God didn't want them to do that. God said, I already sent Jesus to free you from your sins. I don't really care about freeing you from Rome that much. But they looked at this Exodus story and they said, look, God saves us. We can do anything. Well, we're not afraid of Rome. Rome owns the whole world. We're a tiny, tiny country in the Middle East, but we're not afraid of Rome. Because we have God. Let's use that story ourselves. If we don't have to be afraid, then what is there as a church that we can't do? What is there as a church that we can't accomplish? If we don't have to fear because we have God on our team, because God is near, what is there that we can't do? Paul says it like this in Romans chapter 8, verses 31 through 32. He says, "What shall I say about such wonderful things as these? If God is for us, who can ever be against us? Since he did not even spare his own son, but gave him for us all, won't he give us everything else?" And then 1 John chapter 4, verse 4 says, "But you belong to God, my dear children. You have already won a victory over these people, because the Spirit who lives in you is greater than the spirit who lives in the world." So what is there that we can't do? If God is for us, if God is on our team, if God is near, and we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be afraid of what's out there. We don't even have to be afraid if we succeed or not, of failure. What is there that we can't do? Next month, like Jeremy mentioned, we're going to have February devoted to evangelism. And we're going to build everything up to that last Sunday. I want to ask you, why can't we expect to be standing room only in here? Why can't we expect that? Why can't we expect to grow and grow for God's kingdom? Why can't we expect us to be a regional center for God's church? Why can't we expect God to do amazing things here? When we decide to put our vision, to put kind of what we expect, let's set it way, way, way up here. And let's let God kind of fill in the rest. Because I'm not afraid of doing that. I'm not afraid of looking like an idiot for saying, yeah, it'd be great if we could have 250 people here. Because God is with me. And God is with you. And who is ever going to be able to stand against us? Let's pray. God, we love you and we are on your team and we want to be a part of your mission in this world. We want to jump on board with what you're already doing. God, you are working, you always have been, and God, we want to be a part of that. And so, God, we just ask that we have the courage, we have the awareness of you being close to us, being with us, that we can go and we can do anything. We don't have to be afraid of what's out there. We don't have to be afraid of the obstacles. We don't even have to be afraid of failure because, God, we know that you're near and that failure is only an opportunity for you to work. God, we love you, and we just ask all this blessing of courage and strength. We ask it all in Jesus' name, whom you gave us. Amen.